Hello and welcome back to the second half of Module 10. The first half we looked at Nietzsche and some of the very provocative ideas that he had in terms of a very unique form of a social contract, basically the master-slave relationship and the notion or the possibility of being masters without slaves. The second part here of Module B, we're going to look at another response to the social contract, specifically the notion of anarchy. And anarchy is a theme that runs through political philosophy in a very explicit way, but in ethics and society, it really hinges specifically on our understanding of social contract. So we started with Thomas Hobbes, if you remember in this book here, The Leviathan. And in The Leviathan, along with the other books that we've looked at over the last 2 weeks, Locke and Rousseau and Mill, we know that each philosopher was trying to construct a kind of an argument in favor of the social contract, in favor of us coming together and forming into a society that was tolerable and free, had a degree of liberty that built into it. And so each one, in trying to set this up, was also trying to argue that the social contract is a better alternative to the fictional state of nature. Now, if you remember, not each of them, right? Hobbes was really the only person that was trying to argue from the position that the state of nature was a terrible place, that life is nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes and Rousseau really are much more tolerant and conciliatory to the idea of a state of nature. But for Hobbes here, we'll start with him. And he says that in the Leviathan, that anarchy is the negative pole of democracy. In other words, the opposite of democracy. But he also adds in chapter 31 that the condition of mere nature, that is to say of absolute liberty, is anarchy in the condition of war. So we have two ideas that are being presented here, that anarchy is somehow the opposite of democracy as a political system, and that absolute liberty within a political system is also anarchy. So we have to ask ourselves, does anarchy signify democracy as the negative connotation, or a want or lack of government, or simply the possibility of absolute liberty? So keep those ideas in mind as we work through all of this material, because they will come back, and the idea belongs to Hobbes, will echo throughout some of these slides and the ideas that we present. So he writes here in chapter 46, if my Roman numerals are correct, and when the same men shall be displeased with those that have the administration of the democracy or aristocracy, they are not to seek for disgraceful names to express their anger in. They call readily the one anarchy and the other oligarchy, or the tyranny of the few. So these are the people who are displeased with the administration of democracy. And he says, that which offends the people is no other thing that they are governed, not as every one of them would himself, but as the public represented, be it one man or an assembly of men, think fit, that is, by an arbitrary government, for which they give evil names to their superiors. And he goes on, without such arbitrary government, such a war would be perpetual. The argument he's making here is one in favor of government, but not an arbitrary government. If you remember back from a couple of weeks ago, Hobbes argued exclusively for an absolute government, an absolute power, right? A monarchy. And this is the comparison that he's making. Anything less than that, even democracy, could descend into tyranny very, very quickly. Now, the second individual we looked at, coming out of this book here, Two Treatises of Government, is John Locke. And Locke, as I mentioned, is much more fair, more conciliatory towards individuals in a state of nature. And yes, on the one hand, he does echo Hobbes' idea that revolutions are much worse than the state of nature, of pure anarchy. But at the same time, we know that revolutions are still volatile and unpredictable, difficult to quell, depending on the situation that causes the revolution in the first place. So revolutions are much worse than the state of nature of pure anarchy. The inconveniences being are great and is near, but the remedy farther off and more difficult. So revolutions are happening within a system. The system is falling apart. What holds that system together is what is being attacked. But at the same time, Locke says, okay, that can happen, but he doesn't dismiss anarchy outright. because he now refers to his form of government, which is a democratically elected one. So he says, look, anarchy could be a legitimate response to an arbitrary government that mistreats its citizens. For Locke, government may be legally dissolved if he who has supreme executive power neglects or abandons laws that have already been put into place. And so he writes, this is demonstratively to reduce all to anarchy, and so effectively to dissolve the government. So Locke reserves the right for anarchic behavior if the government is arbitrary, subjective, inconsistent, favors one group of people over another on a consistent basis, and ultimately is not really supporting and favoring the group of individuals that it is supposed to lord over. So anarchy is a possibility if the government is arbitrary. And that whole situation, even before revolution breaks out, Locke, believes that is still leading to anarchy. So he writes, may the commands of a public official be opposed? Okay, interesting. Quote, may he be resisted as often as anyone shall find himself aggrieved, he writes, but imagines that he has not right done him. This will unhinge and overturn all polities, and instead of government and order, leave nothing but anarchy and confusion. So anarchy and government hinges on the effectiveness of government to represent the people, the voice of the people, and if it doesn't, that is a kind of anarchy. Not necessarily revolution, but a kind of anarchy, because there's misrepresentation on behalf of the government of the will of the people. So what is most relevant for Locke is this interesting relationship between anarchy and authority that is wrongful or excessive or arbitrary or capricious or whatever. For Locke, right, a lawful government has to establish its will from the people because they have been elected. It's not an absolute monarchy. It's not a king. It's not an aristocracy. These are duly elected individuals that are lawfully there. But once that government no longer represents the will of the people, then anarchy can be something that will result because there is essentially no government at all. If the government does not represent the people, that in itself is a kind of anarchy. And so this is the point that Locke is trying to make. Now, the third individual we looked at, and that was last week, from this little book here, The Social Contract by JeanJacques Rousseau. Let's sort of do a quick recap before we jump into Rousseau. And there are kind of four ideas we've just discussed here. The first is that Hobbes and Locke view anarchy and the original state of nature as essentially the same thing. And so it is a kind of absolute monarchy. There are essentially no rules, other than perhaps moral rules or ethical rules that are sort of brought down from the community. But they're not laws in the sense that we talk about laws today. First one. Second, both Hobbes and Locke believe that anarchy is akin to having no government at all. No government at all, or poor, ineffective, capricious, subjective government. That is a kind of anarchy. And then here are the two differences. For Hobbes, anarchy and democracy are different interpretations of the same form of government. Some individuals are simply hostile to the notion of being governed at all and will retaliate and revolt in some way or another. Hence, we need absolute government, right? We need a government with absolute power. Locke, on the other hand, says that anarchy is no better than an arbitrary, democratically elected government. So if it is arbitrary, it's anarchic in the sense that it just does what it wants and does not represent the will of the people at all. So now we go on to Rousseau. And so with these four characteristics, let's take a look at an idea and a statement in Rousseau's Social Contract, which every time I read it, I'm never quite sure what he means because it's been written out and almost in a kind of cryptic sort of way. But here it is. In order then that the social pact may not be a vain formulary, in other words, a useless idea, it tacitly includes this engagement. And this is kind of what underlines the social contract, the ground or the warrant, the context, we'll say. And here it is, that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be constrained to do so by the whole body, which means nothing else that he, unfortunately shall be forced to be free. So let's read that again. Whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be constrained to do so by the entire body, the body politic, which means nothing else that he shall be forced to be free. For such is the condition which, uniting every citizen to his native land, guarantees him from all personal dependence, a condition that ensures the control and working of the political machinery, and alone renders legitimate civil engagements, which without it would be absurd and tyrannical, and subject to the most enormous abuses. So individuals end up being forced to be free. And it is this notion that those that do not follow the general will, really the general will override your individual freedoms. And the end result is this notion that if that is not agreed to, then governance and governing may become very difficult and could end up being tyrannical, right? The greater the force of the government upon its people, then the more tyrannical that government will be, because the general will is such, we must follow these things, and you don't have really a choice. You're going to be forced to be free, not only forced to follow the general will, but forced to be free within that society. So right now we have a kind of odd understanding of anarchy. We haven't really defined it yet. We're getting kind of a little bit closer, which is really what the remainder of this presentation will be about. So at the very least, we know that it has to do with these notions of absolute liberty and absolute freedom that are found in the state of nature, and the degree to which they are imported into the social contract and then protected by law, right? The general will, being forced to be free, and so on. So we don't have a definition of anarchy just yet, but what we do know that it has a great deal to do with the contrast between individual liberty within a society and liberty that is protected by law. So therein lies the kind of the crux, the possible disconnect that we want to look at. Okay, so let's kind of break down the word and see if we can achieve a definition at this point. So the prefix "an" means not or without. Let's say archy, right? Archy is a form, a suffix for government, rule, as in monarchy. We see archy at the end of it, aristocracy, oligarchy. So these are forms of government. So if we put it together, anarchy means no government or no rule. So let's keep that definition in mind, that working definition, and see if it means both or perhaps one more so than the other. So does the absence of government equal the absence of any guiding or uniting principle? That's what we want to think about, because in a class on ethics and society, we need to consider, okay, if we have no government, where will be the rules that we need to follow in order to live well, right? And to live a safe life. So what we're looking for now is trying to identify those guiding principles. Now, guiding principles, that idea goes back in political philosophy right to the ancient Greeks. And surprisingly, anarchy and arche share the same common root, the same idea, because arche in Greek means beginning, origin, or first principles. And in political philosophy in particular, it means first place, method of government, authority or command. So there is built into the word arche not only an originary impulse, but an originary impulse towards authority. So anarchy is the refusal to buy into this. So if, and I'll repeat this again, if arche means both beginning and authority, the beginning or the first principles of authority, anarchy is the rejection of this notion of first principles, specifically as it relates to authority. So why is this important? Because what's happening at the time that Hobbes is writing, the term anarchy appears for kind of the first time in what we now in hindsight call humanist political philosophy. Now, even though this is an ethics course, we do delve in political philosophy because we are looking at the social contract. So humanist political philosophy is distinct from religious philosophy or medieval political philosophy, which is very much contingent on the notions that are brought down by religious institutions. And for example, the church that had an iron grip on basically Western Europe and that part of the world for well over 1,000 years. So now we're at a point where we are writing humanist political philosophy. And so for Hobbes, trying to unpack what that meant, the question was pretty straightforward, right? We know that Hobbes really wanted to try to answer the following question. How can humans organize themselves effectively, right, responsibly? And we saw earlier that anarchy appears as that evil other, right, to monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, or even democracy. So all of these types of governments, the opposite for Hobbes was simply complete anarchy. Now, that was the view in the 16 and 1700s, and that has changed quite dramatically over the last couple of 100 years, 300 years or so. And one of the more recent ideas of governance and its relationship to anarchy is something called self-governance or self-management. And so in 1941, Herbert Reed wrote the article, The Paradox of Anarchism. And he talks about the paradox as a kind of difference between the social contract that we've talked about and what he calls a functional contract. And so what is that? A functional contract is the main characteristic of an anarchic society, right? Individuals arrange their own affairs. They follow rules based on functional acts. Notice they follow rules. It isn't pure anarchy. It isn't chaos. So anarchy and chaos are two different things. So individuals arrange their own affairs, follow rules based on functional acts because people still want to get paid at the end of the day. They want to be able to come home to their apartment and still have it be there. So chaos is simply truly that, complete chaos, no order of any sort. But an anarchic society still does follow rules, but they follow different rules, functional rules. And these functional acts basically allow people to work in a functional kind of way so that we have individuals coming together, voluntarily coming together to achieve something. So this is really where the change with anarchy in the 20th and 21st century begins. Right? This is during the Second World War. So he writes in paragraph 3, anarchism means a society without an archos, without a ruler. It does not mean a society without law, and therefore it does not mean a society without order. The anarchist accepts the social contract, but he, unfortunately, I say sick because it should be they, but he interprets that contract in a particular way, which he justifies and believes to be the most justified by reason. So if the action that's being asked to be performed, right, whatever the individual is being asked to do, if it is reasonable, they will follow through. So the anarchist accepts the social contract, but interprets it in a unique way. And they interpret it in terms of reason. Is this justified? So at this point now, we're moving towards a clearer definition a little bit. We know where it comes from. It starts in political philosophy. It has, the term at least, has roots in ancient Greek thought and the Greek language of arche. And so the working definition here should begin to include the idea of a society with a degree of law and order, as well as particular kinds of social contracts. And so this should be, at the very least, pretty different than what we typically think of a bomb-throwing anarchist. And there have been bomb-throwing anarchists in the past, but we're looking at the theory here. We're not looking at the practical applications until a little bit later. And I'm saying that because there is a difference between what's called large A and small a anarchism, because there is really a difference. And so we'll look at the large A form of anarchism first, because that is essentially what we've been looking at so far. Now, at the time that anarchy appears in Hobbes's political philosophy, it's an opposite to any kind of political structure, any sort of ism. And then the term sort of dies away when it's no longer needed because society has been established, industrialization has come along, capitalism has come along, and has helped to structure society along certain patterns, certain lines. So the term returns in the 19th century with as a kind of insult. right? To be an anarchist is to be someone that is hell-bent on chaos, antisocial. And so the French socialist and philosopher Pierre Proudhon is actually the first person to declare himself an anarchist. And he writes, although I am a firm friend of order, remember, law and order is still there. Although I am a firm friend of order, I endorse the full force of the term anarchism. And so Proudhon is responding to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizens, which was a text, it's basically a charter of rights that was put together following the French Revolution. And it was supposed to guarantee the natural and inalienable rights of individuals. Liberty, equality, property, security. So those natural rights, the very same ones discussed by Hobbes, more so by Locke than by Hobbes, and also by Rousseau. So these particular rights are very important, are entrenched in law. But what Proudhon is pointing out is that property, right, that's one of them, really has no bearing whatsoever on these other rights of liberty, equality, and security. These are aspects that deal with individuals no matter who they are, no matter who the subjects are. So liberty, equality, security are sacred foundations, are natural foundations, are absolute rights for the traditional social contract. Where Proudhon has a problem with the Declaration of Rights, the Rights of Man, is this notion of property, because for him it stands outside of society because it designates only certain people. So he says, look, how can we consider ourselves equal and free and have a degree of liberty if only some individuals have property that is protected and others do not? If that is so, then this particular right is not social, but in fact antisocial. It becomes divisive because there are those who have power, who have property, who have influence and sway in the structure and the makeup of government, and especially laws that are brought in by governments, and those who are not because they don't have property. So there is the beginning of the notions of large A anarchism, and this is in the early 1800s. Now, following the First World War and the carnage that resulted from it, large A anarchism once again became a kind of viable political alternative. Think that the fact that the First World War, following moral and political and philosophical logic, simply led to carnage. So the question is asked, do we have an alternative? So writing in 1917, the year before the end of the First World War, Emma Goldman stresses that, again, capital A anarchism urges individuals to think, to investigate, and to analyze every proposition that is asked of them by the state. And her vision is one that, again, is still based on liberty and harmony, but more harmony in terms of laws that are there and the degree of freedom that individuals have, so that we can achieve a kind of real or true social justice. So she writes in 1917 in Anarchy what it really stands for, and she writes, Anarchism, the philosophy of a new social order based on liberty unrestricted by man-made law, the theory that all forms of government rest on violence, the notion here of enforcing the law, the notion enforcement. So all forms of government rest on violence and are therefore wrong and harmful, as well as unnecessary. It is the only philosophy which brings to man the consciousness of himself, which maintains that God, the state, and society are non-existent, that their promises are null and void, since they can be fulfilled only through man's subordination. So to subordinate our freedom and liberties and pursuit of happiness to the maintenance of the state, does that not mean at the same time that we lose a degree of that freedom and liberty that we allegedly have, and according to Rousseau, forced to be? So she writes, Anarchy or anarchism is therefore the teacher of the unity of life, not merely in nature, but in man. As a result, there is no conflict between the individual and the social instincts. So, as you can imagine, there are clear problems with large A anarchism because these are ideas that we have no clear example. We don't have a version of anarchism that was successful. Most of it is theoretical. It's not happened very often where large A anarchism has taken a foothold and has maintained any kind of degree of consistency. It is a position. It is a theory. And so ultimately we need to look at, okay, why is it that this isn't working? And we can say that maybe the claim on freedom, specifically absolute freedom, is the one that really is problematic with people. To what degree can we have absolute freedom? Is that even possible? Can we have absolute freedom within a social structure? So, large A anarchists believe that they have the closest relationship to freedom because of that harmonious blending of individual and social instincts, the kinds that Emma Goldman was talking about. So, for a large A anarchist to view power, political power in particular, it's always a rejection because in their eyes, political power crushes freedom. It doesn't enhance it, it doesn't support it, it doesn't make sure it's protected by law, but it seems to work the opposite, right? Where freedom is absent, social life becomes impossible. So there's a connection between the degree of social life and the degree of freedom that is necessary for social life to unfold in a realistic and harmonious way. That's essentially what they're saying. Okay, so that was large A anarchism. Since about the 1970s, there has been something called small A anarchism or post-anarchists or anarchism. One of the most one of the earliest examples is Saul Newman. And this person was presenting a new idea. Rather than destroying the state, he was more concerned with what he called direct action. And these would be protests that would be using anarchist terms, or at least anarchist viewpoints, without having to frame themselves as such. In other words, people that were acting this way may not even have considered themselves to be anarchists. They simply were in favor of direct action. So Newman rejects these concepts that are traditionally associated with anarchism: absolute freedom, absolute liberty, essentialism, that somehow the essence of human beings is to be completely free, the positive notion of human nature that we see in Locke, or even the concept of political revolution, that perhaps direct action may lead to political evolution, right? There's always that possibility. So any form of self-organizing or self-management against the state, any type of extra-legal or illegal activity, would constitute, possibly, examples of small A anarchism. And just in the last 50 years, essentially in my lifetime, I have seen all of these. So small A anarchist activities or direct action have included the following: anti-war demonstrations of the 1960s and then later in the 1990s, ACT UP protests in the 1980s on behalf of finding a cure for AIDS, the global justice movement of the 1990s, the Occupy movement of September 2011, the Standing Rock protests of 2016, the Black Lives Matters protests of the early 2000s, and so on. Each of these, although not called anarchist behavior or direct action, could still fall under that umbrella, that purview of small A anarchism, because it is still a form of direct action designed to change something. So the result is protest or direct action combined with aesthetic or theoretical components. That all that means essentially is, what is the theory behind that action? Because we need to always have an action to be informed by an idea. So you cannot just go out and randomly cause chaos. You need to be able to have a theory or an idea behind why you're doing it. What's the end result, right? What are you trying to achieve? So, as I mentioned a moment ago, those who engage in this kind of direct action, protests on behalf of Black Lives Matter or Indigenous rights, safe water, safe drinking water protests, all of these don't necessarily have to be viewed by the individuals themselves and as anarchistic behavior, but it certainly looks like it. So individuals who participate don't typically think of themselves as anarchists, but it does fit the bill, right? It fits that format. So since the 1980s, when we talk about theory, the aesthetics and the theoretical component of small A anarchism, scholars like David Graeber have traced out this idea that started somewhere in the 1960s and have traced it out even on a global level, that around the world. And if you look, prior to the pandemic, there were many, many protests against government corruption. And government corruption is probably one of the most consistent forms of protest, or at least goals, that you see literally around the world, in the Middle East, in South America, in parts of North America as well. I mean, there are protests of just, irresponsible government or corrupted government. The Occupy movement in September of 2011 was exactly that, against government corruption. The fact that these companies were being bailed out by using, government money, taxpayer money, and taxpayer money were not going to education, social programs, but to bail out banks who knew better, right? So they screw up, lose people's money, and then get a bailout. So they can do what? Do it again? So when these individuals are thinking about their activities, they may not necessarily be thinking of themselves as small a anarchists. Still, that's kind of what it looks like. So direct action may be more likely the case of anarchistic behavior, because these are tactics that are associated with them. And so what the idea is here is to change the conditions, right? In direct action in society would be the social conditions, or if it is a protest through work, it would be changing working conditions. And that's where it comes from. Direct action comes from protest within industry to basically do something better. And direct action was considered to be something that was more effective because rather than waiting for legislative or administrative intervention, because it is corrupt, workers needed to do things on their own. So the notion of direct action was the idea of the direct power of the worker. So the question still remains, what if the goal or the target of the protest is something ephemeral, like sexism or racism? Racism exists, and it exists in society. It's often entrenched in laws, and especially in the US, and it's certainly in Canada, we're not immune from it. But how does direct action work when we're dealing with something like sexism, racism, and so on? These aren't actual things. There isn't a building where, that we can protest in front of. So it becomes a lot more difficult to define direct action here because we are behaving in a way that we're looking to change something, but the target is more ephemeral. It's more diffused through society. But we can still sabotage things, culture jamming, hijacking, art activism, hacktivism as well. These kinds of things are protests that we can engage in, but the question still has to be asked, is it still effective, right? Does it do anything? So at the end of the day, we're kind of stuck in the society that we have agreed to, that social contract that we bought into. And philosophers now, such as Rainer Sherman, talks about this double bind that individuals find themselves in modern society. And it is a weird kind of combination of both the individual and the totalizing of all these individuals, allegedly all behaving exactly the same way. So we're acting like individuals, but we're also radically exposing ourselves to the state by allowing the state to organize virtually every aspect of our lives. If that's the case, then what happens to freedom and liberty? And here's the scary thought. Just as an example here, I said, let's get an Instagram account. What if it's against the law not to have a social media platform? What if it becomes against the law to not have a Facebook page or a TikTok page, Instagram, Discord, whichever one you're on? What if it was against the law to not be on the web? Wow, right? Think how scary that is. So we are now exposing ourselves to the state. I mean, clearly these days we're exposing ourselves to advertisers. And if somebody wants to investigate our behavior on the net, they can do that. But the algorithms that we have these days are basically to sell us commodities. But what if we got to a point where the government said, no, we need to have you online. We need to see your online presence. And if you don't, that will be breaking the law. That's a kind of a scary thought. So ultimately, we want to think about anarchy. We want to think about direct action. And so there is no consensus at all. There are some theorists, such as Giorgio Agamben, who believes that direct action is misguided. And here's what he says in his 2019 book, Creation and Anarchy, which is behind me and I forgot to pick it up. He says, capitalism itself is often the target of direct action. Now again, capitalism is this diffused thing. Isms, racism, sexism, capitalism, they're diffused aspects of society that we can't ever say, well, here it is, right? There's the building. So he says that capitalism itself as a system, often the target of direct action, is perhaps the most anarchic power ever to exist in the literal sense that it can have no arche, right? That is no beginning or foundation. It just suddenly begins to exist. And if you are a historian, you can find roughly where it happens. But there is suddenly this day when capitalism seems to be pervasive. And for about 150 years, it was basically only involved with industrialization. But eventually, capitalism began to gobble up everything in its path and commodified everything. It commodified art. It commodified social interaction. And this is what Agamben is talking about. It is, in fact, capitalism that is anarchic, right? It has no rules. It has no laws. It has no conscience. It has no morals. And it certainly has no beginning or foundation in the traditional way that we were looking at it, because if you think of the arche, right, it is a principle, it is a beginning, but it is also an authority. So capitalism acts as if it does have all of these things when in fact it doesn't. So Agamben says anarchy is what becomes possible only when we grasp the anarchy of power. The fact that if we were to grasp that power, we could in fact redefine a world that is better all around, that is less less diffused with all these isms that only benefit certain people and not others. Okay, so here we are at the very end. This is basically, again, going back to the double bind. And this is an idea that also was written about by Michel Foucault. And he says that we need to liberate ourselves both from the state and from the type of individualization that is linked to the state. And that is this weird double bind, right, of individualization, heavily pressed, and yet totalization. You've probably heard many other professors talk about, the algorithmic bubble from the internet and how, kids on social media, right, don't talk to each other. And yes, people my age look at others that are half our age and are using social media. And let's not kid ourselves. The internet is an incredible revolutionary tool. But what's happened in a very short time is individuals have ended up in these algorithmic bubbles through social media. So they are individualized to such a degree that connecting with one another is really much more difficult, because the question becomes, how do you define connection? Someone half my age would say, hey, they're a Facebook friend. Okay, done deal. But do we really have substantial relationships with one another? And so we have individuals separated from one another, but all together, totalized together under this modern power structure. So what Foucault is saying is that we need to liberate ourselves from the state that requires and desires that. And if there ever is a law that says, you must be on the internet, that's going to be pretty terrifying for a lot of people. So to repeat, the conclusion would be that the political, ethical, social, philosophical problem of our days is not to try to liberate the individual from the state, but from the state's institution, to liberate us from the type of individualization which is linked to the state. Now, you're probably wondering why I've got this picture here. And this is a Twitter, it's a Twitter feed that was taken down very quickly by the CDC, because it was a pushback for individuals once they get their vaccines to, go back to work. And it caused such a commotion that it was pulled down very, very quickly. It took me a while to find it. Trust me, as soon as it was pointed, it was put out. The response was so negative, and people were ready to destroy this thing, right? Direct action, that it was pulled immediately. But if you read, my job puts me at high risk for COVID-19 exposure. Absolutely. I got vaccinated because it's better to be protected than to be out sick. So in other words, it's better to go and continue working and put yourself in harm's way, because economically, that's what the state wants, right? It wants the economy to keep on moving forward. Now, I'm not in any way advocating, anti-vaxxing, or I'm not anti-science. I want to continue wearing my mask. I'm making this in April, and right now the sixth wave is really going to be in full swing. But I wanted to show this to you as a very contemporary example of the way in which economics and politics work together to create a situation where the so-called freedom that we have, in this case, the freedom to work, is now forced upon us, right? We're forced to be free, as Rousseau says. So we are forced to go back to work because we were given a vaccination. So that should be more than enough. And it doesn't allow people the choice to say, you know what, I don't need this. But lo and behold, this past couple of years, a lot of people have rethought where they work, their future, their lives, and whether it's worth it, whether they want to risk their lives, in a dead-end job. So I will leave you with that, and we'll just very quickly go through the key points. Hobbes and Locke view anarchy in the original state of nature as essentially the same thing, the existence of absolute liberty. Hobbes and Locke also believe that anarchy is similar to having no government at all, and the difference between the two, Hobbes, anarchy, and democracy are different interpretations of the same form of government. So for Hobbes, democracy is chaos. Anarchy is chaos. For Locke, anarchy is no better than a bad government, right? An arbitrary, democratically elected government. Okay, then we talked about the ways in which the term anarchy began, and we looked at the word of the original Greek arche, which meant beginning or origin or first principles. And these became the sort of the foundation of political thoughts because the arche, right, that first principle, also relates in political ideas to a legitimacy, an actual government. So here, anarchism is more practice than a pure theory, because with anarchism, right, the notion of mutual help, protest against the state, activism, don't need to share a common origin. Quite often, they're very spontaneous, right? They don't have a first principle. So anarchic behavior can be looked at by other people as chaotic, but it just simply does not have an origin. It grows spontaneously. So we talked about Herbert Reed, this idea that the anarchic society is one where individuals arrange their own affairs and follow rules that are based on functional acts. So in the same way that we have self-management, we can now control ourselves and we can act in good working order, right? We can volunteer to come together with other individuals. And then finally, the last point, we talked about different types of anarchism. There's a large A anarchism, which is Proudhon and Goldman, versus the small A anarchisms of Newman, Graeber, Agamben, and Sherman. And so to go back, the large A, notions of property, notions of wealth, notions of liberty, equality, and security that, yes, are sacred, but somehow are not properly represented in the eyes of an anarchist as something that the government is really going far enough to provide. And then finally, small A anarchists ask whether individual freedom and liberty can even still exist, because any form of self-organizing against the state, any type of extra legal or illegal activity directed against the state, which is different forms of direct action, protests and demonstrations, are actually examples of small A anarchism. And that's it. So a lot of material. Thank you for sticking with it. Hopefully you have a clear idea of these two different types of anarchism, the history of it, the Greek root of the word, and then its beginnings in Hobbes. So thanks very much, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.